John Lear is a retired airline captain, former CIA pilot, as well as the son of the famous inventor of the Lear jet. He is a Lockheed L-1011 captain and is highly regarded in aviation circles. He has flown more than 150 test aircraft and has won every award granted by the Federal Aviation Administration. John also holds 18 world speed records and has worked for 28 different aircraft corporations. And during the late 1980s, into the early 1990s, John began coming forward with startling revelations concerning the subject of aerial phenomena and unidentified flying objects. He is our special guest tonight on Coast to Coast. John, my pleasure. How are you?
George, it's an honor and a pleasure to be on the show with you, and I'm great.
The disclosure briefing that I just heard that I played, is that based on things that are or things that could be?
Most of that was real. In fact, all of it was real. If I had to make a change, I'd make the change, which isn't important, about why they killed Kennedy. There were so many reasons they killed Kennedy, but one of the main thing, the reason they killed Kennedy, he was insisting on inspections of Dimona, which was Israel's nuclear manufacturing plant, and they couldn't have that, and so Mossad, in conjunction with several guys at CIA, one of which was, I'm trying to think of his name. Anyway, they got together and they planned that thing and eliminated Kennedy. Now, there's a few things that they left out in that briefing for Art. And one of them was that EBE-3, who was captured in 1953, who they named J-Rod, helped them build their own flying saucers, the United States government.
Is that the one that Dan Bursch person is talking about?
I've seen those tapes, and at first I thought that Dan Bursch stuff was not real until I saw the videotapes of him, and I said, yes, that's real. He was there. I know the protocol, and he was there, and the stuff that he says is real. And later in the program, I'll tell you some of the stuff that he is going to be talking about is not. It's disinformation, but basically that's not his fault. By 1962, we had vehicles, while they could not perform the faster-than-light speed of the alien vehicles, we could certainly get them to the moon in about an hour. Regular trips to Mars, we were making regular trips to Mars in 1966. Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were all cover missions, and most of the astronauts knew it. And on January 27, 1967, a fire in Apollo 1 atop the spacecraft, I think it was Pad 39A, killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, and one other astronaut. But this fourth astronaut was not one that we knew. The fourth guy was one of the secret astronaut corps that was formed along with the astronaut corps that we knew about. The difference being that the astronauts in the secret corps were going to the moon in 1962, while the public was watching the Mercury astronauts circle the globe.
Oh, really?
And after constructing various buildings and mining facilities by 1966, we landed on Mars. And since then, we have explored most of the planets in our solar system and found life similar to us on all of them. Now, one interesting thing, George, remember Mars rover a few years ago had the dust settle on the solar panels, and it couldn't recharge its battery.
Right, it looked like it was going to die. Yeah,
and then all of a sudden, it was the dust was gone, and the batteries recharged, and everything was normal.
Right, and they blamed some kind of wind, a dust devil that knocked it off or something.
Well, what really happened was that was our secret astronaut corps up there with paper towels and Windex.
John, you believe that one?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the guy that told me that, who is not living anymore, when I had expressed disbelief in some of the stuff, or, not expressed disbelief, I said, are you sure this is true? And he told the Mars rover story. He said, yeah, that's who went up and cleaned it.
All right, here, let me ask you this, John, and we're going to get into a lot of interesting things with you tonight, and you've got credentials all the way down your arm, and I want everybody to understand that, because I'm going to ask you some specifics of your life. I want them to understand who you are, who we're talking to tonight. Why would they even need rovers there if we had astronauts already on the planet?
It's part of the cover-up. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the space shuttle, it's all to keep our eye on that while the other stuff is going on.
A huge, bigger picture, no doubt.
Huge, bigger picture.
All right, let's talk a little bit about John Lear. Of course, the son of the famous inventor of the Learjet. I don't know if anybody's ever asked you, John, about your father and how he even came about inventing this jet. That I'd like to know.
Well, in 1930, he formed what was known as Lear Incorporated, and he built millions and millions of dollars of equipment for the armed services. They were in the form of actuators, screw jacks, fuel pumps, all kinds of stuff. And in 1956, he wanted to improve an airplane, which was a Lockheed Lodestar. And he took the Lockheed Lodestar, put more powerful engines on it, cleaned up the wings, retracted the tail wheel, did a lot of other things, and it became known as the Lear Star. They sold 62 of those airplanes as executive airplanes. But the program was not successful. There were several major accidents, one of which killed Mike Todd over there in Grants, New Mexico, and one which killed the entire board of Johnson & Johnson Company, and it was not successful. In 1958, he wanted to design a brand new airplane, and oddly enough, the new airplane was going to be a pusher-type airplane, but it developed into the Learjet, and at that time, they say that he was the first. He wasn't the first. They had the Sabreliner and the Jetstar, the North American Sabreliner and the Lockheed Jetstar, and he came along and he started building the Learjet. He went to his board of directors, and they said, "No, Bill, we're not going to go along with this. It's not going to go, and you're not going to spend our money." So he sold his stock in Lear Incorporated to Siegler Corporation. It became known as Lear Siegler, and he took that money, $7 million, and started what was known as the Swiss American Aviation Corporation in Geneva, Switzerland. The reason he moved to Geneva, he thought there was availability of engineering talent, availability of raw stockpile materials, and that he could get the airplane built there. But after a disastrous 3 years, in 1963, he moved to Wichita, Kansas, built a plant there, and continued the design and production of the Learjet there.
The rest history. Did he ever know Howard Hughes? I would bet Hughes would have been all over him to get those jets.
No, he knew Howard Hughes. They had a big beef, and it's my understanding that the problem started with Howard borrowed an airplane from Dad and left it somewhere out of gas and never told him where it was. And forever after, they were not so much enemies, but didn't talk to each other.
All right, tell me a little bit about John Lear. I mean, because you grew up then in the aviation industry, and it obviously had a lot to do with the direction that you took.
Well, I grew up in Santa Monica, California, went to Santa Monica High, used to spend all my time out at the Santa Monica Airport. It just irritated my dad to no end because he didn't like pilots, oddly enough. He was a pilot himself.
That is interesting.
But he didn't like pilots, and he didn't like me getting into aviation, although he did provide the airplanes. There was a Bonanza and an Aero Commander out there, and I used to fly them around, got my private, then my commercial, then my instrument. And I used to hang around at the Santa Monica Tower and work the B position and then A position, just as a kid in high school. And it was a lot of fun, and that's all I wanted to do. As a matter of fact, in 1960, after I graduated from high school, I was in his office there that was on 3171 South Bundy, and he called in the plant psychiatrist, and the guy's name was Plass, P-L-A-S-S. And he said, "John, I want you to talk to Mr. Plass here." He said, "about your hopes and desires," and he was actually having me evaluated by the plant psychiatrist. So we go off in another room, and I talk with this guy. He says, "What's going on with you and your dad? John? I said, well, I want to be an airline pilot. You know, that's what I want to do. I love to fly airplanes, you know. Dad wants me to be an attorney or a doctor, and he says I can earn enough money to buy my own airplane. I don't want my own airplane. I just want to fly an airplane. And Dad says that's just like being a bus driver. And I said, well, you know, so what's wrong with being a bus driver? So anyway, we go back into Dad's office, and Dad said, well, did you guys get straightened out? And Plas says, well, Mr. Lear, I think he has some pretty good ideas for what he wants to do. Dad threw us both out of the office then.
Well, it was a love because just by reading some of the writings you've done, John, and your background, it followed you all your life into different facets as well. I mean, ending up as a pilot for the CIA. Would you do it again today? If today's CIA said, hey, John Lear, we need some help, would you fly for them?
No, it's different today.
It is.
Everything's different today. I've been retired 5 years since May of 2000 when Kitty Hawk International went bankrupt. I was flying the L-1011 for them. And, you know, I had took all my licenses. I had them laminated and framed, put on the wall so I would never be tempted to use them again. I canceled all my aviation subscriptions. And you know what, George? I don't even look up in the sky anymore. When I flew, and I've talked to a lot of friends that flew when I was flying in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I flew in the best of times. I flew the greatest equipment and flew the most interesting missions, but it's not like that anymore. In those days, we knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were.
Right.
And these days, you don't. You don't even dare get in the business because you don't know who the good guys and bad guys are.
And I bet you knew all those. You knew the Jaegers. You knew everybody during this era.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, while we're on that, I'd like to note the untimely passing of Scott Crossfield, who was killed a few weeks ago.
That's right. He was a giant. He was a giant
of
in the
mine
business.
In a weather-related crash in the Cessna 210. Scott flew the Douglas D-558 Skyrocket to Mach 2, and he also became the first man to exceed Mach 2 and flew the X-15 to Mach 2.97. Now, I want us to set the record straight tonight, George, on who really was the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound in level flight. Chuck Yeager has always been reported to be the first,
yes.
But Chuck was less than gracious, acknowledging who really was the first, and less than gracious regarding other pilots' accomplishments. When Scott died a few weeks ago, Yeager made the comment that Crossfield has always taken chances. A few years ago, Yeager had this to say about the nonstop round-the-world flight in the Voyager by Gina Yeager and Dick Rutan, and I quote, "A monkey could have done it."
Oh, man.
Yeager has always been relentless in his criticism and dislike for civilian test pilots, even going so far as to say in one interview, but as airplane drivers, they really weren't as skilled as military guys. Now remember, George, this is the same Chuck Yeager who personally crashed one of the only two Lockheed NF-104s in the aerospace training program. He not only screwed up the climb profile, this was the airplane that was built for the astronauts to test their skills in, and it also was built to go over 120,000 feet. Chuck not only screwed up the climb profile, he not only screwed up the pitch over, he screwed up the descent so badly that he had to bail out with the loss of the airplane and the termination of the program.
Right. Wasn't there a segment of him in the movie?
Yes,
was it The Right Stuff?
They glorified it, too.
Yeah.
Chuck should have been fired. Personally, I think a trained monkey could have done better, but the person who really broke the sound barrier for the first time in level flight was Slick Goodland, test pilot for Bell Aircraft, who built the X-1. Slick made 26 flights in the X-1 before they handed it over to the Army and exceeded Mach 1 on at least 2 of those flights. The Air Force, however, wanted to hog the limelight and the glory and the credit, so the data tapes were impounded, and General Boyd, who was head of the Flight Test Center at what then was known as MUROC, chose Yeager. And even though there were other pilots equal to or more qualified than Yeager, General Boyd picked Yeager for the Mach 1 attempt because he felt Yeager was the most expendable. Slick Goodland passed away last October, never having achieved the recognition for his achievement, mainly because of the Air Force politics.
And he just kept quiet about it.
Yep, he just kept quiet about it. And you can go on the Internet and look at Slick Goodland. There's several websites of his accomplishments.
Now, you're quite the person, John. I mean, here we are. We're going to be talking about UFOs and some incredible thoughts and theories you have about that. But you also, and I noticed this today with gold up over $720 an ounce now, you own a gold mine, don't you?
Yeah, it's the one of the two certificated permitted gold mines in Clark County, and it's out in Gold Butte, about 50 miles east of Las Vegas. And I love it out there because, you know, there isn't another person for 50 miles. It's high desert country, 4,600 feet. It's old Indian country. And I just love to go out there and weld and pound nails and get ready. And we're just about set to start milling in about 2 weeks.
Think you're going to hit the mother lode?
Well, it's a vein, George, that runs about a mile and a half, and people have worked this vein for many years. But it has various concentrations, and we may make a little bit, but you know, basically, it's an excuse for me to get out in the open air and enjoy myself.
How old are you now, John?
63.
Oh, you're still young. You are still young.
Yeah.
Well, good for you. Now, how did you? Because this started back in the '80s. How did you get interested? I mean, here you are, you know, a test pilot, airline captain. All of a sudden, you're interested in unidentified flying objects, UFOs. How in the heck did that start?
I'll tell you exactly how it happened. I was over at a friend's house across town that I knew for years and years. I was walking through his living room. On the table, there was a book called Missing Time by Bud Hopkins, and I picked this up, and I kind of thumbed through it, and I said, the guy's name was Al Newell, and I said, Al, can I borrow this book? He said, sure. I took it home, and George, I don't know what came over me, but when I read that book, I said, this is real. And then shortly after that, we had a reunion of Southeast Asia pilots here in Las Vegas. And a friend of mine, Greg Wilson, who was a Raven, and you know who the Ravens were. They were the people that were taken out of the Air Force, given civilian ID, and they flew for the U.S. ambassador in Laos against the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese. And really a gung-ho guy. And we got to talking at this reunion, and I said, you know, where all you been? Because he flew A-10s. He says, oh, different places. You know, I was over in Bentwaters. I said, Bentwaters? Well, what about that incident in 1980 where a saucer supposedly landed? He said, John, I was there. He said, I didn't see it, but I was confined to quarters, but I know the guys who did. And I thought, well, there's the second thing. And so then I just got interested and started researching. And I once took a trip throughout, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and I met all the guys that were in it. I went there and talked to them. I talked to Benowitz. I talked to Ernie Edwards, Colonel Ernie Edwards. Linda Howe and I went on a trip from Albuquerque down to Roswell to talk to Clifford Stone. And when I came back, I said, man, I can't believe it. This stuff is really real. And that's when I wrote that first statement that floats around the Internet that starts out with Giordano Bruno. And
yeah, whatever. Okay. Did you, because of your background in aviation, also because of your name, strong name, did that help you trying to open up doors to investigate UFOs or trying to talk to people who might not have spoken to you? Did that help?
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember of any incidents where it would. The only one that it did kind of help me is I went to research the base at Dulce, New Mexico, and I pulled into town driving my old GMC truck, and I checked into a hotel, and I had the name of Gabe Valdez, who was the highway patrol guy there, and I called up Gabe, and I said, my name is John Lear. I'd like to chance to meet you. He said, John, we already met. And I said, we did? And he said, yeah, 10 years ago, you flew in here in a Learjet with Dean Martin's girlfriend and a load of steaks for Dean Martin. He was shooting a movie. You're the guy that met you at the airport.
I love it.
So he came over to the hotel, and his shift was 10 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning. And I spent 8 hours with Gabe Valdez, in his patrol car, roaming around the mountains at night around Dulce, and I'll tell you, it was an interesting experience.
John, you've got me interested about that Apollo 1 fire, so when we come back, let's talk a little bit about that. Our special guest tonight, John Lear. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. I'll tell you about that song in a moment when we come back. Hey, the book that we put out with Bill Burns called Worker in the Light is available for pre-orders at Amazon.com. And the book comes out on September 19th. I'm taking part of my proceeds, and I'm going to give them back. This is me now, not through the network, to Coast listeners for the list that I've already assembled. And I know it's taken a little long, but hold on. The book comes out in a few more months. But those of you who want to take advantage of the pre-order at a substantial discount, you can go now to Amazon.com. You put in the search section book, and then either my last name or Worker in the Light. Hey, John, I've got to ask you about that bumper song we played by the Byrds, 242 Foxtrot. Was that you in the background, I heard?
That's me, and Mylon Haven was the co-pilot. And I got to tell you a funny story
Sure.
here. Cigar Aficionado magazine in October of 2003 made a big, lavish story with many pictures. It was 7 pages long about the 40th anniversary of the first flight of the Learjet. Now, I read this story, and I'll tell you, for a magazine like Cigar Aficionado, I can't believe there was not one single fact in that story that was correct. And I wrote Marvin Shankin and asked him about it. Of course, never heard about it. But just let me read you what they wrote about. They interviewed Roger McGuinn, who was with the Byrds, and they said, well, you know, what was it like flying with John Lear? And I'm quoting from Roger in the magazine article. He says, John once gave us a ride from Los Angeles to Pensacola for a Byrds gig. McGuinn recalls. I think it was fellow Byrds members Dave Crosby, Chris Hillman, and Gene Clark and myself, and we had Peter Fonda along. We came into Pensacola at too high an altitude, and John did a maneuver called a split S to get down. I was sitting in the cockpit with him, and John was just a kid like us. He liked to go fast. He explained that the split S to me was a steep dive that would have us coming out upside down at the bottom. I'm agreeing with him, and I'm saying, you better tell the guys back there to buckle up. Well, says McGuinn, who was feeling a bit ornery that day, I didn't bother. The daring maneuver in the Learjet 24 left the passengers in the rear a little spooked, but otherwise unhurt. They could thank the man who created the Learjet in the first place for the plane's dexterity in tight situations, which has always been one of its attractions. Now, George, can you imagine a magazine like Cigar Aficionado printing a story like this about a guy who's flying Part 121, airlines? I mean, it was just
strange.
Okay, so as a gag, I wrote Clay Lacy, who I was working for Clay Lacy Aviation at the time, and this was back in 1966. And so October 5th, 2003, I said, Dear Clay, if you haven't seen the latest issue of Cigar Aficionado, I am closing an excerpt. I have kept this incident secret for many years, but now that it is all over the newsstands and I am retired, I can finally tell the truth. First of all, we really were late letting down into Pensacola. Hell, we were 30 miles past it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First of all, since I was going to try and make it nonstop from Van Nuys to Pensacola, I had taken the inspection plates off the front part of the tip tanks and topped them off. By the time I got all the Byrds guitars and stuff loaded, I was really beat. We were so heavy that I leveled off at 37,000, set .77 on the autopilot, and asked center for block 37,000 to 41,000. Of course, this was back in the old days when it was pretty easy to do. I was letting each of the band members sit for a little while in the right seat. When it was Dave Crosby's turn, he offered me a toke. Normally, I try not to smoke dope while I'm on duty, but it happened to be some incredible Maui Wowie, and I thought, what the hell? It will probably wear off in the 3 remaining hours of the flight. The flight went great. Everybody was having a good time, singing and laughing and telling jokes, until I became vaguely aware that center was calling and asking if I wanted descent. Here I was at 60,000 feet. The airplane was at 41,000 feet, and it turns out we were 30 miles past Pensacola. I thought the best way to reverse course and lose altitude was to do a split S. So I asked center for lower and permission to reverse course, which they approved. Unfortunately, in all the excitement and the fact that I was still a little foggy, I started the split S but forgot the half roll at the top. What I had done, in fact, was the first half of an outside loop, which is why I ended up upside down at the bottom of descent. Of course, I told McGuinn that this was the way it was done, and he didn't know anything about it anyway. I flipped the airplane right side up and landed without further incident. Of course, the rest of the guys in the back were, in fact, a little spooked. Heck, I was spooked, and I was flying the gall darn thing. But nobody was actually hurt, and I did thank Dad for making the airplane with great dexterity in tight situations to save me. Sorry you had to find out about it this way, Clay, your friend and admirer.
I love it. I love it. What did he do? What did he do when he got that?
Nothing. I called down to the guys that knew him, and he made just one under his breath comment. He said, "That's a lot of bull."
Hey, John, there's so much to talk with you, so little time. But I want to get into your thoughts about planets and that they're inhabited, and definitely I want to talk about Apollo 1. But also, some time ago, you had an opportunity to meet Bob Lazar. I want to get your take on what you think of Bob Lazar. I mean, do you find him to be credible? Do you think he's legit?
Absolutely, 100%, 120%. What anybody ever says, about Bob, disparaging Bob, I can tell you, I was the guy that was there. I was the one that he took to see he took me to see the flying saucer. He knew exactly when it was going to fly. He's the one that got a hold of the 115. I'm the one that saw the experiment. Him and Joe Vaninetti and myself made the experiment.
And the 115 being the element that
powers the saucer.
Powers the saucers, okay.
And what we did is we took a bell jar and we put a piece of dry ice and we put the 115 on the dry ice, then took a Coleman lantern, one of those little, what do they call them, the little lantern panels or whatever they are, that shines light, and these are partially radioactive.
The reflectors?
Yeah, they are partially radioactive, and they're the ones that cause the light in the lantern to be so bright.
All right.
And they shoot out alpha rays. Now, the alpha rays are supposed to go out into space at, the speed of light, but we have videotape of that, the alpha rays being, pulled back down into the 115. So, the bottom line is Bob was real. The whole incident was real. Everything happened exactly as Bob said it did, and I said it did. I've seen the Dan Burrish tapes. As far as I know, he never met Bob, but the stuff that he talks about certainly indicates that S4 is real and that it's there.
And to some people who do not know who Bob Lazar is, he was a self-styled nuclear physicist. He worked at the S4 test site, which is very close to Area 51 in Nevada, back in, 88 to 89.
88 and 89. I met him the summer of 88, and he came over here with Gene Huff, and Gene Huff was a real estate appraiser. And Gene had called me on the phone, and he said, I've heard about all your stuff. I'd like to get some of your tapes. And at that time, I had just been totally swamped with people that want something, and I wasn't too interested. And he said, I'm a real estate appraiser. And at that time, I was looking to get my house refinanced. I said, okay, I'll tell you what. If you come over and appraise my house, I'll give you all the stuff I had. So he came over, and the guy that was helping him hold the tape to measure the rooms was this guy, Bob Lazar.
He was helping the appraiser?
Yeah. And so we sit down and talk, and we're talking about UFOs, and Bob is rolling his eyes, and he says, look, I have to tell you guys, I worked at Los Alamos. I had the highest clearance you can get. And he said, if there was anything like this, I would have known. This is all pure BS. Well, over the next 4 months, and that would have been July, August, September, November, October, we gave Bob some information that he could check out with his friends at Los Alamos.
Right.
One was the existence of the YY-2 facility, which was really secret. Now, we were told that was where EVE-3 was kept. But whether he's kept there or not, the fact was that Bob found out that, yes, that place did exist. And a number of other things he found out, and he decided to re-enter the scientific community. And that's when he called Dr. Teller, and I was there when he called Dr. Teller. And he said, I'd like to re-enter the scientific community. And Teller says, do you want to work in Las Vegas, or do you want to work at Lawrence Livermore with me? And Bob said, I want to work at Area 51. And Teller said, well, let me see what I can do. And so then a few days later, Bob gets a phone call from some guys at EG&G, and he went over, and over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, got 3 security interviews. And on the second security interview, and of course he told us all what they asked him, the first question was, do you know John Lear, and what's your opinion of him?
Interesting.
And he said, yes, I know John Lear, and I believe he sticks his nose in places where it doesn't belong. And Bob said, what I didn't tell them is I also like to stick my nose in the places
exactly.
it doesn't belong. So then the first thing, the next thing I heard is, I think it was around December 6th of 88, he's sitting in front of my desk here one evening, and he said, I saw a disc today. And I said, what? He said, I saw a disc today. And I said, you went up to Area 51? He said, yeah. And I said, then what are you doing here? I said, they're probably following you. Why don't you find out what's going on and then come back and tell me? He says, no, John, you've taken so much flack over this stuff. I want to tell you that I saw it and it's real. And that's how the whole thing started.
Oh, my God. How did he describe the craft to you?
He said that he walked in the hangar. They let him in. He's always had two guards, one on each side. They let him through the hangar door, or the hangar door was open. And he said he walked by it and he saw an American flag. And he thought, well, this explains it. This is just stuff that we have. And he said he put his hand on the disc, and he said it felt cool to the touch. And he said only later did he realize, no, this can't be ours, because when they gave him access to the inside, the chairs and everything were, for people that were like 3 feet tall. He said this is nothing that we could fit in.
That had to have been quite a sight for him.
It was, and it was quite an experience for me. I'll never forget those 2 years. They were the most exciting in my life. I wouldn't trade them for anything. I never thought in a million years when I started to get into this UFO business, because, you just can't get any information. I never thought I'd get, that close to what was really going on.
And at that point, you got to know our friend George Knapp, who was doing some fill-in hosting for us. I did an interview with George. John was several months ago, and I said, you know what, George, I'd like you to fill in for us once in a while. And he did one show for us, did a great job. And because he is such an expert at what he does, he's a perfect mix for us as a team.
Absolutely. And how George Knapp got in it was I won't go into it. There was 3 times that we went up to the test site with Bob to watch the saucers. The first one was May 22nd, 89. Then the next one was a week later. That was the one that George went and filmed. And then the last one was April 6th, a week after that. And that's when I went up with Bob, his wife's sister, and Gene Huff. And that's when security caught us. And the next day, they hauled him up to Indian Springs, which is the head of all security for the Nevada test site. And they said, now, Bob, when we gave you this clearance and showed you the flying saucers, it didn't mean you were supposed to tell all your friends about it. Now, do you want to work here or not? And he was noncommittal at that meeting, but a few days later, he decided not to go back. And the reason he told me is because the last few trips, when he went up on the 737 there, loading at the terminal, and the terminal used to be over there on Sunset, he said, John, I could remember getting on the airplane, and I could remember getting off it, but I couldn't remember anything I did up there, and he said I didn't want to work under those conditions.
Yeah, never again.
So coincidentally, about that time was on Sunday, I had done a show with George Knapp called On the Record, and George called that evening. He said, John, we have had thousands of phone calls. What can I do for an encore? And I said, well, let me make a call. So I called Bob, and this time he had decided to quit. And I said, do you want to go and do the George Knapp news tomorrow night? And he said, yeah, as long as they don't show my face. So that famous interview of Bob was done in my driveway against the sun, so they couldn't see his face.
And that was a dramatic documentary, that whole program.
Yeah, and then the next night, George had Bob Stoldow come up. Bob was the head of Channel 8, and we sat around the table, and Bob, asked us a bunch of questions, and George wanted to do, a long 6-part series, and Stoldow didn't want to go with it without being convinced. And after he talked with Bob and found out the whole story, he told George, go ahead, and that's where the 6-part series came from.
You've touched a lot of lives and careers in this field. Lots of them. Apollo 1, of course, January 27th, 1967, horrible tragedy when a flash fire occurred in the command module, killing what we always thought then, John, were those 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee. But you say there was a 4th. Was he... the capsule didn't have room for 4. Whereabouts would he have been?
Let me quote from the book Apollo, The Race to the Moon by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox.
Okay.
It's an interview with Joe Shea. Joe was the head of ASPO, which was the Apollo Space Program office. And Joe is lamenting about the fire and not being there and so on and so on. And page 223 says, for Joe Shea's the accident Serenades achieved a dimension of tragedy. Consider the paradox in Shea's narrow escape when only a technical hitch kept him from being in the spacecraft during the fire. So lucky for him, it first seems, that they couldn't hook up the headset in time. so morbid of him, it first seems, to wish occasionally that he had been in the spacecraft after all. And yet if Shea had been in the spacecraft, he would have been sitting in the bay beneath the astronaut couches, down by the ECU, and the netting that probably first caught the fire. Now, I've got all kinds of books and drawings on Apollo, and there was not plenty of room, but they used to have a fourth guy down there that would, monitor and, check out things and, be, for various reasons during these practice countdown tests. So there certainly was room there.
Do your sources tell you that there was a fourth person there?
My source is deceased now. He was, George, a true insider. And he didn't tell me much, but he did tell me a few things. And one of them was, he said there was a fourth guy in that fire. He said I was brought in immediately afterwards. He said I went up to level 8, and he said the National Security Agency had cordoned off the area right after the fire, and they spent 45 minutes removing that body. And then they let NASA go in there and remove the rest of the bodies. And so I thought, that's pretty interesting. So I started doing research, and just one little thing after the other points to, yep, by George, there certainly was one. Now, George, this happened in 1967. You figure there might have been 30, maybe 35 controllers in that room. They were all between maybe 25 and 35 years old, maybe some older. They're between 70 and 75 now. Some of them are still alive. So if they're listening to the program, I would appreciate it if you call in and say, you don't have to identify yourself, just say, yes, the story is true. I can't tell you any more than that, but there was a fourth guy. And if they want to do this, they can give me the first letter of the last name of the guy, which I know, and of course I'm not going to reveal it, but if they'll just give me the first letter of the last name of the guy, then we'll know that guy was there.
Okay. Now, if he was there and they're covering it up, again, why would they do that? Why don't they simply say, well, we had 3 astronauts
because they would
and
have
a fourth?
They would have had to explain who he was. And they would have had to explain who he was, what his background was, and he was part of the Secret Astronaut Corps, and that would have exposed the Secret Astronaut Corps. And they couldn't afford, under any circumstances, to expose the Secret Astronaut Corps.
Tell us why. Why the Secret Astronaut Corps?
Because, George, we have many things going on. As I've told you, we've been going back and forth to the moon since 1962. We've been going back and forth to Mars since 1966. We have programs going on that are unbelievable. All the rest of the stuff is cover-up. The shuttle, all this stuff is just, it's cover-up for what is really going on. And as hard as that is to believe, I'm hoping that someday, you're going to find out this is true.
I want to get your thoughts on that, John, when we come back at the top of the hour about what really is going on. He's got some incredible things to say. Also believes that the planets in this solar system inhabited by beings much like us. We'll get John Lear's take on that as well. John doesn't have a website, so I do not have one for you to go and take a look at. He does not have a book to sell. He doesn't have anything to sell here. He's just here to talk about some of the things that he knows that we are sharing with you tonight on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, John Lear. Much more to talk with John about. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. John, I have always heard, for better or worse, that our government cut a deal with extraterrestrials for knowledge, for technology, and gave them the abductions, primarily because they figured they couldn't stop them anyway, so they might as well get something out of it. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, they cut the deal, and they got the technology, but they had no idea that they didn't have any, there was nothing they could do about it anyway. And they cut the deal saying, well, we'll only let you abduct this many. Well, of course, the fact is, George, Earth is not so much of an experiment as a farm. They whoever they are, if you want to call them aliens or whatever, they use this as a farm. They harvest, they manufacture souls, and we are just containers. This information comes from the yellow book that Bob read at the test site, and that's the deal. Now, whatever they have to do to keep us in line, if they have to go to the government and say, look, we want you to help us keep our secret, and what we're going to do is give you some technology, and, of course, we'll limit our abductions. But, you know, that's just the story.
How many do you think they've taken from this planet, John?
Well, I used to say 1 in 10. I don't know whether it's any more or any less than that.
It's still a lot of people when you're talking about you're talking about 1 in 10 on this planet, right?
Yeah, now they're not taking them. Understand? They're just monitoring them.
Ah,
they take you.
All right.
They take you once when you're about 3, once when you're about 7, and once when you're about 11 or 12, and then usually that's it. Now, what they do, I don't know, but that's when they just take and monitor you.
What did you mean by soul harvesting? What are they doing?
It's my opinion that they manufacture the soul. The soul is a little electronic device that's installed in each human being as they're born, and it records all the emotion, all the senses, color, sight, sound, all that stuff, and it records all your life. And then when you pass away, when you die, that soul goes up to the moon. And there's a big, what we call the big soul machine on the moon. That's the picture that Hoagland has that came in lunar orbit 384M. I got a picture of it right in the middle of Sinus Medai. As you know, the moon is in a rotational lock. The same face points towards Earth at all times.
Right.
And right dead center is a plane called the Sinus Medai, meaning middle cavity. And right in the middle of that plane is a huge structure about 7 miles tall. It's a cube sitting on a tripod. Now the tripod appears to be about 3 or 4 miles tall, and then the cube itself is about 1 mile on a side. And I think that's where the soul goes after you die, and then whatever they do with it, whether they send it right back, whether they wait a couple of weeks, whether they wait a couple of months, it's sent back into a newborn baby and goes through a whole life cycle again. Now, each one of these souls records the entire human emotion of a lifetime. The problem is for us is we can't remember that. We can't take advantage of mistakes we've made. It just keeps recording on one soul. There might be 1,000 lifetimes. Now, if you go back in history, you'll find there are people that, for some reason, don't have their memory blocked, and they can remember back several hundred years ago. I remember this lady went back to England. She remembered her entire life there. She could tell the people that were there. They went to the gravestones, the whole thing. She remembered everything, and that happens occasionally to people. But in fact, the soul records, all the particular lifetimes that it's been through.
John, I know that Richard C. Hoagland has been very important to you in some of the work you've done, and so I'm bringing him online for a little bit to chat with you and us as our advisor here.
Interesting.
Some of we'll do a mini roundtable discussion for a little bit right now. Hey, Richard, how are you?
Hey, good evening, George.
Good. Richard, I wanted you to be part of this primarily because I've always heard that you've been very important for John and some of his work and research. And years ago, when you started talking about some structures that you believed were not on just Mars, but on the moon, that I think, John, and I'll let you speak for yourself on this, how influential has Mr. Hoagland been for you?
Well, very influential. When I saw the Moon-Mars connection, I was flabbergasted. This was the most interesting thing I ever saw in my life, and that's what made me start looking for this stuff. And I happened, just by accident, to get 2 photos out of NASA that were unretouched. One was the north face of the crater Copernicus, and the other was a photo taken by Lick Observatory in 1947. And I want to make it clear that I do not believe that Richard believes any of this stuff about souls. That's my idea, not his. What I'm saying is Richard found the that thing in the Sinus Medai and found the picture of it, which
Well, I have a little surprise for you, John, tonight. I just earlier this evening got off the phone with my assistant, Carrie Clark, who is a photo expert in New York, and she did some of the early work on the original Apollo data that we procured out of Houston, out of the LPL, out of the Goddard National Space Science Data Center, and she has found a print for you of this several-mile-high glass tower, this ruin that I found on 84M, which is one of the lunar orbiter shots taken back in, I think, 1966. So you will be getting that.
Fantastic.
Exactly.
You're making good on your promise that you made 4 months ago, right?
Well, she's been looking. She's been on the road, and we have this incredible archive, and we kind of distributed it around the country. You know, Steve Troy has parts of it. I have parts of it. Other people have parts of it. Carrie has parts of it. And we had to go finding, because these are all analog prints. There's nothing computerized, nothing digitized. These are the original analog images that came down from both the unmanned lunar orbiters in the 60s and as well as the Apollo Hasselblad, another film from later in the 60s and the early 70s. So you will be getting that. Now, George, I have something to announce.
Okay, go ahead.
This fall in Southern California, just about 2 hours east of Los Angeles, I'm going to be doing the first of an experimental series of retreats where we're going to have like 4 days to get people together and really go through where we are on the eve of some major breakthroughs that I think are coming. And I'm going to be revealing and publicizing and unveiling some absolutely mind-blowing lunar imagery that unquestionably answers the question that one of your callers in the first hour had, did we go to the moon? Yes, ma'am, we went, and we got the photographic proof. And, John, it is going to blow your socks off when you see what it is we found.
I can hardly wait.
And it is in color. It is corroborated. It is in the official database. It's available for anybody to go check. And it raises so many profound implications as to who has known what and when. And I appreciate that you kind of separate me from your theories as to what all this stuff means. But in terms of the evidence, gentlemen, there is no question that NASA has been hiding not only the stuff on Mars, but an extraordinary ancient set of ruins right next door on the moon. And I fully concur with John that there are two space programs. There is a secret program. There's the official program, which is the cover. And when you say, well, why would you spend $16 billion a year on a cover? Well, it's not their money. It's our money. They don't care how much they spend as long as they keep us in the dark.
Well, why don't we see those rocket ships going up for the secret program?
Because they're not rockets. George, come on.
What are they?
They're electrogravitic anti-gravity spacecraft that, you know, Tim Ventura and I have been discussing, which the Russians are discussing in the open literature, which are visible on the STS-80 and 48 videos that I have provided to Art, and I guess you've probably seen them too.
Yes, I've seen them.
Whitley, you know, used one of them, I think, on his NBC program some years ago. There's a concurrence between the two programs, but, I mean, my own intel sources, of which I have a few and they're very reliable, have unquestionably verified that there are two programs. Now, this Britisher, this Gary McKinnon, who was...
he's the computer hacker.
Yeah, who broke into NASA computers. He found years ago pilot lists, officers' lists, the squadron names, the names of their ships, all this stuff, and that's why we're throwing the book at him, and we're going to give him 70 years as a lesson to anybody else. Don't do this or we'll put you away and throw away the key. And this is treason. This is a national disgrace, and I'm so glad that John is on the show tonight talking about it, because the more of us that talk about it seriously and point out that there are two programs and all the astronauts risking their lives in this rat trap called the shuttle are basically doing it because they believe in God and country, and how the hell they wind up going up on that thing when there is real technology to go all over the solar system. It has to be because someone appeals to their higher patriotic purpose and they say, mankind needs you to do this. Well, mankind doesn't. These rogue groups are running the program, and even Ed Mitchell, you know, the Apollo 14 astronaut who walks on the moon, has said again and again and again that the rogue groups have taken over the programs and they're running the show.
You agree with all this, John Lear?
Absolutely. Richard is right on, right dead center.
You know, it's pretty startling, I think, just to even imagine that this could be going on.
Well, we had so much evidence over so many years, and the really pernicious part, George, is you got to ask yourself, they used to say that the only difference between men and boys was the price of their toys.
Yeah.
These are very pricey toys. Then you have to ask the question, if they're secret and they're in the hands of people that have no accountability, and we just saw today what happens when you have government agencies running loose with no accountability, every single phone call recorded since 2001 by the NSA.
Do you believe, because I got to get into this with John soon about his belief in life on the planets in this solar system, but do you, Richard, believe that these structures on the moon may have been the ones that Ingo Swann has always said that he saw during his remote viewing episodes?
Yeah, because he saw things on the moon and on Mars. And some of the things on Mars, remember, even Dame says some of the stuff on Mars is still, quote, alive, meaning it's ticking, it's technology that's still functioning. And our models cover that. The hyperdimensional physics says you can produce technology that will last, hundreds of thousands, not millions of years, because you're not using any known power sources. The stuff doesn't have friction, it doesn't wear out, it doesn't corrode. So, yes, you can certainly envision robotic emplacements of things that are still active. We see in these photographs ruin after ruin after ruin. I mean, when you come to Joshua Tree on the Columbus Day weekend, which is a 4-day weekend, we're going to do this up really well in the desert with a lot of interesting material, with enough time to go through it. I am going to show you stuff on the moon that will knock your socks off.
All right. John Lear, what about the propulsion of these vehicles, then, if there's this other program underway? Where are they taking off from? 51?
No. The only place that I know for sure is Sandia. They're north of Kirtland Air Force Base.
I'd also look to the outback of Australia, gentlemen.
Yeah.
In the middle of a continent which has only 13 million people, and most of them are Aborigines.
Yeah.
You could create entire cities, George, in the middle of Australia, and no one would ever know. But we do have reports, Aboriginal reports, of very strange things happening. That's where Pine Gap is located. Remember that facility? I think Australia is the place because it's literally on the opposite sides of the planet from 535 people who are supposed to be minding the store and have been looking the other way for 50 years.
All right, Richard. We'll get those pictures to John because I'm sure he'll love to see them.
Thanks, Richard.
All right, Richard. Thanks. Appreciate you being part of this. Well, John, I guess common sense would tell you this can't be, I guess. Don't you think?
That what?
That this can't be. There can't be another program out there that's been so technologically advanced. My mind just doesn't want to believe it.
Well, let me tell you this. In 1956, my dad was heavily involved in anti-gravity research. As a matter of fact, floating around the Internet, there's a 2-minute film of him giving a lecture at the Bonson Institute, and behind him is a blackboard, and he's explaining how flying saucers fly. My mother is standing next to him, and then in this 2-minute film, for some reason, there's a calendar. Something is very, very important, and they're marking off the days, and then they have a picture of a lab, and they have very flimsy type tissue paper and balls of paper constructed models of flying saucers, and I don't know what that's all about, but I do know this. When in the last 35 years have you read in any technical journal, any aerospace journal, any airplane journal, anything about anti-grav? You haven't read anything, and the reason is because they've already solved it.
All I heard was when I was in St. Louis, and at one time, it was the headquarters for McDonnell Douglas before they got bought out by Boeing. I had heard that they were working on some kind of anti-gravity device somewhere, maybe out on the West Coast, but that's it.
What year was that?
That would have been about 99, I think I would have heard the story.
Well, they had all this completely solved and ready to go in the early 60s, and they've had it since then. But you're not going to see anything in Aviation Week. You're not going to see anywhere else any remotely discussing the subject of anti-grav because they've already got it.
What about the whistleblowers? How come they're not coming forward?
Well, I'll tell you, there used to be whistleblowers, but there aren't any more, George. In 1989, 1990, when I first got into this, there was guys coming from the black areas up at Area 51, and they'd knock on the door, and if I wasn't there, they'd tell my wife, they'd say, I work up in the black area, I just wanted to tell you your husband is right on. And then about 1991, it stopped. Somehow they figured out how to keep a secret. And I haven't heard a decent rumor since then.
Do you think anything happened to these people?
No. Well, maybe they did, but there was 4 or 5 of them that used to come by and give me little tidbits. But that ended in 1990, 1991, thereabouts.
And they just stay away from you now?
Oh yeah, they're somehow they've learned to keep a secret. It could be mind control, or, whatever it is. But a secret is a secret now, and it's very difficult to find out. The only way I get information, and I had 2 sources. They're both dead now. They were in the program. They had been in the program forever, all their lives, and they were about to pass away. They were about to die. And I had a chance to sit down with them and talk with them.
John, have you had friends or colleagues, people who've been pilots, who have called you over the years saying, "You're right on, John, we've seen things"? I mean, do they come out and support you, or do they run away from you?
No, usually they don't talk about it, but just tonight I heard a really funny story.
What'd you hear?
There was an old cargo airline I used to work for. It was called Rosenbaum, and they were doing a cargo flight about 1 o'clock in the morning from Chicago to Seattle. The guy who told me this was the flight engineer, Mike Tydell, and they're flying along, and they're looking ahead. They're up about 35,000 feet. They're looking ahead because air traffic control had given them FedEx. 12 o'clock, 20 miles.
Yeah.
And of course, you always look to see the airplane to be sure that, the spacing is correct and everything. And they're looking ahead, and behind this FedEx, this huge circle globe, lighted globe, comes whizzing toward them. I mean, at 10,000 miles an hour, just when it gets between FedEx and these guys' airplanes, that heads north towards the North Pole, and they watch this thing, zip as far as the eye could see. It was huge, and as it disappeared, there was a total silence for about 5 seconds, and then the co-pilot says, "Now there's something you don't see every day." It was hilarious. Everybody started laughing.
I love it. I love it.
Real low key. Now there's something you don't see every day.
Why don't you have a website, by the way?
I don't know. I just.
You don't have anything to gain here tonight, John.
No, and I'm so busy I wouldn't have time to keep it up. And
also, there was a 10-year hiatus before you came back to talk on Coast, and
yeah.
Over that span, why did you stay away, and then what made you come back?
Well, I don't remember exactly the reason. I think it may have been, that 10 years, I think that started in 92 or 93. I don't remember exactly what kicked it off, but you get to a point where you don't learn anymore, and then you get tired of it, and then you don't want to hear any more stories, and you just walk away. You're busy. I was busy flying. That was towards the end of my career, and I was busy with the 1011 and different airlines.
Yeah.
And one night, Art called and said, man, I want you to do a show and everything. And he more or less talked me into it, and so I got back into it.
He has a way of doing that.
Yeah, he sure does.
Okay, stay with us, John. Back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, now it gets really wild. John Lear believes all the planets in the solar system are inhabited by beings much like us. We'll get his take on that. And I got to tell you, what a fast program tonight. I think we have a new propulsion system behind us. This may be one of the fastest shows I've ever participated in. Back in a moment with John Lear on Coast to Coast AM. We're going to take phone calls next hour with John Lear, and one of the things John would like you to do, if perhaps you have some inside information on that Apollo 1 fire, if you want to be able to tell him some information. John believes that there might have been a fourth person involved in that horrible tragedy, and he's going to ask you to give him the initial of that person's last name. And maybe as a test to see if you really know what you're saying, and if you're above board with us when you make the call. John, all planets in the solar system inhabited by beings like us?
I believe so, and let me say, not might have been a fourth guy. There was a fourth guy.
Okay, so you believe that entirely.
Absolutely.
All right.
And before we get too far, I just want to say hello to my friends at the Nighthawk Zone, Bad Boy, and at the Fantastic Forum, Spike, Mike, and all my friends there.
Good for you. They are great people.
Now, as far as the planets being inhabited, Mars, the population, I think, is 660 million at this time. Most of them live underground. When Bob Lazar worked up at the test site, he was shown photos of Cydonia region, very close-up photos of the Cydonia, and those pyramids had doors and windows. There was no doubt about it. I mean, it was very clear. Bob and I went down to JPL and met with the head of I'm thinking it was Mariner, but I'm not sure. I forget the guy's name. But we asked him. They said, were there any more photos taken of Cydonia other than the two ones that Hoagland and Dave Pietro have? And he said no. And then Bob said, did you ever take the spacecraft to a lower orbit? And the guy said, yes, but we didn't take any pictures. Now, here's how secrecy works. Here's the guy that's the head of the program, and he knows that it went into a lower orbit, but he didn't know that they took extra pictures. And Bob saw the extra pictures that they saw of Cydonia. That's how compartmentalization works. You might have a certain clearance, but that doesn't mean you get to know everything at that level.
Now, and I want to make sure that I understand this too, John. When we say all planets in the solar system, are you talking about just the ones that are close to Earth, or are we talking about Jupiter,
Venus,
Neptune?
Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Mercury. Mercury is not as hot as everybody thinks it is. And I don't know whether they live above ground, but I believe that there's people from each one of these, and we're fed so much BS. There's so much methane that NASA puts out. I think they generate the methane themselves that they say that all these planets are covered with, but it's just a scam. It's a ruse, so that we don't think that there's any, that we're the only ones there. But there certainly are people on Venus. There certainly are on Mars. Interesting thing, I did a remote viewing class. I went to a class with Angela Thompson-Smith, and it was very interesting. I was shocked. I went to the remote viewing course because I was interested in it, but what I wanted to know is I'm not the least bit psychic. I can't tell when the phone's going to ring. I can't tell when the doorbell's going to ring. I don't know when anything's going to happen. I wanted to see if I could do it, and I'm telling you, George, after the second day, some of the stuff I was doing absolutely shocked me.
Sure.
But at one point, each member of the class got to task the other members into doing something or going somewhere. So I tasked the group, when it was my turn, to go to Venus. Now, I didn't front load them with anything, any of my ideas or anything, just said, the target is Venus. And so then there was the normal cool down period, then they go, then they come back, then cool down again, and then the thing right out of their mouth was every single one of them said, my gosh, that's beautiful. I had no idea, and then one of them said, boy, that's like South Africa. It was green and beautiful and just all kinds of, beautiful scenery there. It's not like, the sulfuric acid covered 90 bars of pressure, volcanic spewed. I think that came about in the late 50s when it was decided that we should not know that there's anybody on Venus. And I can imagine a general sitting around with his staff and saying, now, folks, gentlemen, we have to make Venus as unpalatable as possible. I need some ideas here. And so one guy says, well, how about we make the atmosphere sulfuric acid? Great, that's good. Let's have some more ideas here. Well, how about we make it
it's too hot.
How about we make it to all volcanic lava? Great. Come on, let's think outside the box here. Come on, let's hear some more ideas. Well, how about we make it 100 bars of pressure? And the general says, 100 bars sounds a little phony. How about 90 bars? And they says, yeah, okay, that's good. We got a planet here. Now what else? And they said, they probably said, well, why don't we say that everybody that prints a picture of Venus, we use the false color of gold or yellow. That'll get everybody to thinking, that it's molten lava. And that's exactly what happened. Now we're supposed to believe all that? I can't believe it. How did the Venera land? Did the parachute, landing and floating a parachute down at 90 bars of pressure would be like floating a parachute in the ocean. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Why, John, with my very open mind, and it is, and you've heard the program, and I have an open mind about a lot of things, why can't I accept this, that there are other humans or beings, much like us, on planets in our solar system? I'm holding back on
it's
that.
It's just too much to accept. And, it takes years, to get into this stuff. And I can tell when I talk to a person, I'm so tempted to tell them everything I know, and I can tell the instant that I've gone too far because their eyes glaze over, and you can tell, oh, that's it. That's as far as he's going to go. And the mind just shuts down. They don't want to hear it. They just can't accept it anymore. And the only reason it's easy for me to accept is I've been in it so long, and I've seen so many things happen, and, absolutely nothing surprises me. I was just taking a check on some of the forums on the Internet, and the big soul machine on the moon, which we refer to as the tower that Richard found, I mean, that shuts a lot of people down. They just disappear. They don't want to hear that. It's just too far out for them.
Well, we've got this new fast blast system that we've had for a couple of years, and it gives me instant feedback from people, so I've got some questions that I can roll off for you from some of our listeners as well. And then next hour, we'll just open up the phone lines for you, John. And,
sounds good. And then briefly, George, I just want to say that on the Fantastic Forum last September, I posted a thread called I intend to expose NASA's biggest lie. And that thread, in a period of less than 3 months, attracted 65,000 views.
Oh.
And what I did is, instead of just telling him what the lie was, I made him research the information that led me to find out what the lie was. And I made him research Neil Armstrong's speech at the White House, 25th anniversary. I made him research the neutral point between the Earth and the Moon. I made him research Alan Bean's comment that the sky was as black as a pair of black patent leather shoes. I made him research Edgar Mitchell's comment that he just can't remember what happened on the moon, all that stuff. And at the end, I tell exactly what the biggest lie was, and the biggest lie was that the sky is not black on the moon during the daytime. It's blue.
Just like it is here.
Yep, just like it is here, just like it is on Mars. The sky is blue on Mars. It's not red.
I've always heard that when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, he saw huge alien craft on the other side of a crater.
He did, and the closest he ever came to acknowledging that, Neil Armstrong's only made about 3 speeches since he came back.
Yeah, he had a little conference a few months ago, but you're right.
And I wanted to tell you something. There's a very interesting notation in a book here, and the book is called The Moon Landings, and it's by Reginald Turnell. And on page 239, there's a very interesting sentence, and it talks about Neil and just before they blast off, and it says, quote, "He may have had in mind the 12 men already sealed inside the lunar receiving laboratory, ready to share with the crew their strict 21 days isolation, starting from the moment when it was hoped they would lift safely off from the moon." Now think about that. We never heard about 12 guys in the lunar receiving laboratory. Who were those guys? Those were the guys that told Neil and Buzz and Michael that they weren't going to tell what they saw, on the moon. And it probably spent 21 days, and there was probably some fisticuffs going on. But whatever happened there, Neil never said anything other than he did the one talk after they got out of the lunar receiving laboratory.
And that was it for years.
At the 25th anniversary, and he did the one at 60 Minutes. And
right.
Basically what happened is when he was just, a couple hundred feet from landing, there was a couple of saucers right there. And he had to, he couldn't pull up, but he actually extended where he was going to land so none of the cameras got the pictures of the saucers there. And I thought it was really interesting on 60 Minutes when they're interviewing, I think it was Mike Wallace, and he brings this up. He didn't have to bring that up. He could have brought up anything else, but he said, that field of boulders was really big. And for those of us that know, what that field of boulders was, with a field of boulders, a bunch of saucers. And he had to go to a little place a little farther under, and that's why he burned so much fuel.
One of the keys to all of this, to this entire theory of why they're not telling us, why they're withholding, I think it was buried when Werner von Braun died. When Werner passed on, I think he knew a lot of things, may have told some people. Did you hear anything, John, about him?
No, I've read that he was at Roswell. And interestingly enough, before I ever got involved in this UFO stuff, which I told you was 1985,
right.
when I was flying for an airline called Air Club International, I had a trip to Bahamas, and we were there for a couple of days, and I signed up. I had a scuba diving card, and I signed up for a dive, and guess who my dive partner was?
Von Braun.
Von Braun. Now, I wish I'd have known, enough then to ask him some questions, just like, my dad died in 1978. He used to talk about saucers, but not that much. And it turns out he was right in the middle of it. I mean, he was on the board of Lovelace Clinic. Randy Lovelace was the Air Force surgeon that was transferred from Wright-Patterson to Albuquerque in 1947. And Lovelace Clinic was the place where they did a lot of the autopsies, or many of the autopsies. My dad was close to Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was wrapped up in this thing. The former head of the second head of the CIA, I'm trying to think of his name, and he was part of MJ-12. He had a crush on my mom. These guys were all around the house.
Was that Alan Dulles?
No. It was, I'll remember the name. I'm getting into Alzheimer's here, and I can't recall anything.
Of course, the guy who jumped out of a window was Forrestal.
Forrestal, yeah. And, okay. But anyway, all those guys were around the house. If I'd have known anything then, it would have been great. I would have loved to ask him some questions, but I didn't get interested until 1985.
Where does this all lead us, John? What's going to happen? I mean, are we going to ever get disclosure, or what?
I thought no. When I did that Art Bell disclosure thing, I was firmly against it. And now I've heard some of the stuff that Dan Burrish has come out with, and an associate of, not an associate, but somebody who did the videos, a guy named Ron Garner, and he showed me some of those videos and told me some of this stuff. And it appears like MJ-12, which now apparently has 36 members, wants the information out, but they don't know how to do it. And they want the information out, but they want to put their spin on it. In other words, when I say that we're just an experiment, that it's a farm, it's harvest, they don't want that story. They'll go ahead and admit that J-Rod is from Zeta Reticuli 2,
and he's
but
here.
Their story is the story that if you've read anything about Project Serpo, that spin. And that spin is, Zeta Reticuli is hot, they play soccer, they tell time with a sundial, but you wouldn't want to go there because they don't eat the stuff that we do, and they have families in this, and that's all there is to it. And, of course, that's a spin. That's not the truth. And the way that you spin something is use a little bit of the truth and a little bit of what you want people to believe. The fact is they do come from Zeta Reticuli too, but they don't have families, they don't reproduce, they're cybernetic organisms, they're stamped, they're robots, they're here to carry on the experiment, which is somebody else's experiment.
What do you think of this Serpo group, where they claim that we sent astronauts in an exchange program with extraterrestrials?
We sent astronauts, but not 12 of them. We sent 3 of them. And that part of the story is true.
Did they come back?
3 came, 2 came back. 1 was crazy, 1 was normal, and 1 was dead. And I don't remember whether the dead one came back or they left him there.
And
at least that's the story.
These are Americans?
Yeah.
All right. Well, the Serpo website, which had been down for about a month, is back up again. And it is as bizarre as anything I've seen, John.
Yeah, that's the spin.
Is there a lot of disinformation out there?
All of it is disinformation. I mean, you hardly can get any true information. For instance, the other day somebody said, hey, I heard it. Somebody told me that 80% of the saucers that the public sees are ours. And I said, yeah, they are. I said, we've had them. We've been developing them since 1960. I mean, we've had it since all of those things are ours. There's a few of them that are alien saucers, but most of them are ours.
Most of them are ours.
Yeah.
But we were given the technology. We didn't come up with it on our own.
No, I think, and we weren't given, like I said, we don't have the stuff that can go, hundreds of times faster than the speed of light, because that has technology that Bob Lazar worked on for Dr. Teller, and what they were trying to do is figure out if we could duplicate it any way, and we can't. I mean, you take element 1 to 15, and a little chunk of it, an arrowhead chunk of it, pump in protons, bump it up to 116, there's an annihilation, and the annihilation throws off two things: a gravity A wave and antimatter. The antimatter is mixed with matter to create heat in a thermionic generator to create power for the craft, and then the gravity A wave is siphoned off to use for the gravity generators, which pulls it through space. And that's stuff that, I mean, so far ahead, we don't have a hope of being able to duplicate that stuff. We just don't have the materials.
Element 116, unonhexium. I know that one.
Okay.
That's the only one I know.
Okay, ununpentium is the 150. And if you pump a proton into ununpentium, which is stable, it makes it 116. 116 is unstable, and it decays, and when it decays, it's a total annihilation, and it throws off two things: the gravity A wave and antimatter.
Are other governments part of this, or is it just us?
A lot of them are. We're closest to the Canadians on this, and as you may remember the story I told Art Bell years ago, the guy that came to my house, and he was Air Force photographer stationed in Honolulu, and he got TDY, temporary duty assignment, to Norton. When he got to Norton, he was put in a limo with the windows blacked out and taken somewhere near 29 Palms, and it went down in an elevator. The car went down in an elevator. He got out. They told him to change in this change room. He put on a smock, a cap, and booties, and they gave him a camera, and he walked into this hangar, and there was a ladder up to a saucer, which was maybe about, he says, 40 feet in diameter. He went up the ladder, and he said he poked his head inside to put the camera in there, and he said, John, he said, I couldn't believe it. He said, when I poked my head inside, I could have thrown a football and not hit the edge of the saucer. He said it was so big.
Gosh.
And he said, I stepped back out on the ladder to see if this thing was really, like 40 feet, which wasn't all that big, and it's 40 feet. And he said, I poked my head back in, and he said it had to be 200 feet to the edge of the thing. And he said one of the scientists, he had a Canadian accent, said, come on, guy, we've got to, get some pictures here. And so he went in and he took pictures as they put their hands over consoles, and it would go down and go up and that kind of stuff.
I sometimes think we're on the verge of breaking the biggest story of all mankind, John. I mean, it's there for us.
It could be. I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting.
Stay with us. We're going to take phone calls now next hour in this rapid program. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast with our special guest tonight, John Lear. Well, I don't know why we gave the phone numbers. The lines are already jammed. We'll be back in a moment. John Lear, our guest, will take your phone calls on our next Coast to Coast program. By the way, tomorrow night will be our Friday and the Saturday night open lines. But for the first hour, I'm going to talk with someone by the name of Anonymous about that very strange box called the Dybbuk box. So get ready for that one. But we'll be back in a moment. John Lear, your phone calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Did you ever come across anything, John, which would show that during this episode with extraterrestrials that there were fights involved? I mean, did you have any pilot friends or anybody tell you about that?
No, I didn't, but I've read all the incidents of when we tried to shoot things down, and I think we lost about 200 aircraft.
I remember Art once, a couple of years ago, was talking about an incident that he said he heard that involved a drilling project near 51, and he said they drilled down some 2,000 feet, and as they brought the drill up, it apparently pulled up human flesh, bones, and things like that. That's a bizarre story.
Well, that's, the fact is this is just an experiment, a petri dish, so to speak, and every 25,000 years, I mean, it's proven by historical geological records that every 25,000 years or so, on an average, the Earth is mixed up. It's turned on its axis, rotated on its axis, and everything is wiped off, and they start over again.
Let's go to the phones now.
Well, before we go to the phones,
let's slow down. Then what?
I just want to tell you that I remembered the name of the MJ-12 member that had the crush on my mom. His name was Hoyt Vandenberg, General Hoyt Vandenberg. And he was the second chief of staff for the Air Force, and Vandenberg Air Force Base was named by him.
And as these MJ-12 members died, the rest of the group found somebody else to replace him, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And now there's 36 members.
Still going strong.
Yep.